Hello everyone. In this lecture, I want to talk about how to perform a project stakeholder management. First, I want to talk about who stakeholders are and how we can identify them. Then I want to talk about how to create a stakeholder management plan. Next, I want to introduce some new management practices so that we can manage and control stakeholder engagement in our project management process. Lastly, I want to introduce a case study to you. Let's talk about Samsung's stakeholder management practices and how these practices helped this company to be financially successful. Because the term stakeholders were from a financial industry, many people mistakenly believe that only sponsors or investors are stakeholders of a project. This is obviously a very narrow opinion about the stakeholders, right? From a project management perspective, anyone that can be influenced by the project should be considered as stakeholders of the project. For instance, customers are our stakeholders because the products or services from our project will strongly impact them in the future. The project team members are also stakeholders because our project performance will determine their bonuses, salaries, and compensations in the future. A project stakeholders consists of a variety of different groups. Obviously, different stakeholders have different interests in our project. They also have different influencing power on our project. So we have to develop different management practices to manage the relationships with different stakeholder groups. If you want to identify different stakeholder groups, in practice, we usually use something called the power interest grid analysis to identify them. As you can see on this slide, we want to separate project stakeholder groups according to two criteria: their interests in our project and their influencing power on our project. On the interest axis, we have the plus sign. The plus sign indicates a stakeholder group has a strong interest in our project. We also have a negative sign. A negative sign indicates a stakeholder group has a low interest in our project. On the influencing power axis, we also have the plus sign and the negative sign. The plus sign indicates that a stakeholder group has a strong influencing power on the success or failure of our project. And the negative sign indicates a stakeholder group has a low influencing power on our project. According to these two criteria, their interest and their influencing power, we can separate project stakeholders into 4 groups. Let's talk about these groups one by one. Let's start from the group on the top right corner, this group. This group has a strong interest in our project. They can also strongly influence our project management. Can you give me an example of this stakeholder group? I think investors are a good example, because investors' satisfaction will be a very important benchmark to measure if our project is successful or not. For this particular stakeholder group, as a project manager, you want to consider how to increase their engagement in your project management process. Get to know what this group really wants so that you can take actions to reach their expectation. Let's talk about the second group, the one on the bottom right corner, this group. This group has a strong interest in our project, but they don't have a very strong influencing power in our project management. Can you give me an example of this group? I think team members are a good example. Team members usually follow the project manager's decisions, so they don't have a very strong influence on a project management process, but they do have a strong interest in our project, because our project performance will determine the team members' salaries, bonuses, compensations, and so on. For this group, as a project manager, you want to keep a good communication with them, so that your team members can share the same visions and values with you. Let's talk about the third group, the one on the top left corner, this one. This group has a low interest in our project, but they have a very strong influencing power on our project management. Can you give me an example of this stakeholder group? I think suppliers are a good example. Once the supplier delivers the raw material to our project, their job is basically done. They don't care so much about our project performance. But in some cases, some suppliers could have a strong influencing power on the success of our project. Let's say our project is to manufacture some smartphone, and the screen of our smartphone is solely offered by one supplier. In this case, this supplier will have a strong influencing power on the success of our project. For this stakeholder group, you want to consider how to increase their engagement in your project management process. You want to let your suppliers know that your success will determine their success as well, so that you can transform the weakness of being determined by your supplier into a collaborative relationship with this supplier. Next, let's talk about the last group, the one on the bottom left corner. This group has a low interest in our project, and also they have a low influencing power on our project management process. Can you give me an example of this stakeholder group? Let's say we hire an advertising agency to promote our smartphone. Then this agency would fall into this stakeholder group. As long as we pay for the advertisements, this agency may not care about our sales performance so much. They don't influence our decision-making process either. For this stakeholder group, instead of using a fixed payment, you may consider using a commission-based payment for the advertisements, so that you can use the agency's interest as an incentive for developing a better advertisement plan. This is an example of how to use the power interest grid analysis to identify different stakeholder groups. After we look at each stakeholder group, the next step is to develop a stakeholder management plan. When we develop such a plan, there are some factors to be considered. For instance, project goals, organizational structures, cost baseline, and time schedule. When we analyze these factors, we want to answer some questions for the stakeholder management plan. For instance, what is each stakeholder group's expectations? What actions we need to take? When we should complete these actions? How we perform these actions in order to reach each stakeholder group's expectation? Some techniques are available for you when you develop a stakeholder management plan. For instance, you can invite the senior managers from your company to join in an expert panel and use their past experience to develop a stakeholder management plan. The other option is to form some meetings with stakeholder groups and collect feedback from them directly when we develop a stakeholder management plan. We just talked about how important the stakeholders' engagement is to a project management. Some new techniques have been developed to increase the stakeholders' engagement. For instance, crowdsourcing and crowdfunding. Let's say we want to develop some smartphones. Instead of manufacturing these smartphones directly, we will develop some prototypes and then give these prototypes to future customers. Let them vote which one is their favorite. And then we only manufacture the customer's favorite model. This is the example of crowdsourcing. Crowdfunding takes another step forward. When we ask the future customers to vote for their favorite model, we also ask them to pre-order their favorite model. Using these techniques, we can collect feedbacks about our future products from the potential customers. Because customers have prepaid, their interest is closely tied to our project. By doing this, we can give the stakeholder groups a sense of engaging in our project management process.